The ICF Training and Technical Assistance Team is honored to welcome you to this California Housing and Community Development Training Session offered through the Emergency Solutions Grant, Coronavirus Relief Consulting and Staffing Services Contract. My name is Chris Pitcher from ICF. I'll be hosting our session today. Today's training session is part of our racial equity series and is entitled Calling In and Calling Out. It's my privilege to introduce today's first presenter, Mary Francis. Go ahead, Mary.
Thank you, Chris, and welcome to everyone who's able to join us today. Our agenda today is going to be fairly light because we do want to spend some time as we pivoted here recently in our recent sessions to focus more on personal experiences to really bring a human face to some of these issues that you all encounter. So after our welcome, we're going to talk just a little bit at a high level about anti-racism. We'll go into something called compassionate accountability. And then we'll talk about calling in and calling out in practice, what that looks like, what it feels like, when it's appropriate to do one or the other. And as I mentioned, we'll dive into and tie that back to some of our personal experiences with both. So for today, you've got two facilitators. I don't think we'll go for a full 90 minutes. My colleague Alyssa can introduce herself and then I can introduce myself.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Mary Francis. I hope you can hear me. I tried to find a decently quiet place in the Minneapolis airport, but now I'm surrounded by people. My name is Alyssa Parrish. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am Asian. Happy to be here with you today.
Thanks, Alyssa. We've traded airport places from last week to this. My name is Mary Francis Kenyon. I use she, her pronouns. I am Black, and I'm going to add a couple of my other identities here because that will also impact some of the stories that I will share with you all later. I am the L and LGBTQIA+. I am also the parent of a child who has an intellectual and developmental disability, which is something that I share freely and openly. And those specific identities really influence my personal life, but also my professional life and how I show up and how I'm able to either call in or call out. So moving right along, one of the things we really want you all to walk away with is a better understanding of like what it actually means to be anti-racist. We're going to explore the differences, as I mentioned a moment ago, of like calling in versus calling out and whether or not we should prefer one over the other. From there, we're going to learn about the experiences that both Alyssa and I have encountered in a variety of professional settings. So for some grounding, this is kind of the point where you've already gone through some of the equity foundational workshops, which, oh my gosh, looking back a year ago is when we kind of were first launching these sessions with the state of California and in that partnership. I think at that point in time, we had like 700 plus attendees. And today this is a much smaller group, and that's okay. Folks will have access to this recorded webinar. And always we're open to following up with individuals and individual communities. But to get to this point, you do have to really get some grounding with some of the basics before we start talking about anti-racism in the workplace. So engaging in anti-racism is something that is very active. It's ongoing. It's not passive. You can't stand by on the sidelines and understand how to be anti-racist. Compassionate accountability, which we'll spend a good little bit of time talking about, is just one way of addressing racism when it surfaces. I am naming that I am biased towards that way because I've found it to be a very effective and non-threatening strategy. Hopefully you will as well, but I do want to note that that's not the only way. Calling in and calling out are helpful to think about because there are going to be situations that present where a call out might be more appropriate for a situation that arises versus the calling in. And then another piece of grounding there is that, you know, uncomfortable conversations really prioritizes progress over comfort, also progress over perfection. As long as we're not causing harm to one another, there's no perfect way to call in or call out. So these should look familiar to each of you. These are our engagement expectations when we're in this space together. We do expect for each attendee to be present and listen actively while maintaining mutual respect for differing viewpoints. Don't seek a one-size-fits-all approach. I just talked a little bit about compassion and accountability being one avenue to call in or call out, but it's certainly not the only avenue. We are all here because we want to challenge the way that we've historically responded to homelessness. If what we've been doing over the last several decades had worked, we'd all be working on like solving poverty, but we're just not there yet, and we have to change the way that we respond. Also, want you, each of you, to see yourself as a part of the solution, because you bring with you your own unique perspectives, identities, and experiences, both personal and professional. And it, multiple minds is way better than one. Do think about continuing to prioritize attendance in future sessions. And we don't have any polls today, but we strongly encourage you all to participate in the chat. Chris, Alyssa, myself, and Aaron are all monitoring the chat and want this to be engaging for you. So in the vein of understanding your identities, please in the chat drop your name, pronouns, racial identity, and any other identities that you'd like to share with us. Also, drop in the chat why you decided to join this specific session with us today. Give folks just a minute to get the chat rolling. All right, so keep typing along in the chat. I'm going to move us forward so that we have an opportunity to hear about the content. So I think by now, all of you or most of you will have heard about anti-racism. You've probably even attended many of the trainings that ICF and its teaming partners have brought through the ESG CV work that we've been doing with the state of California. Love this quote up here that says, anti-racism is the commitment to fight racism wherever you find it, including in yourself. This is a quote from one of my favorite authors. If you are a bookworm like myself, there is a great book. It's a starter book, very well-rounded, by this young lady here up on your screen, and it's called So You Want to Talk About Race. Really cool book. Also has like a working guide that goes along with it. Again, very non-threatening way. So check it out if you haven't already. So in case the term anti-racist is new to you, I don't think it will be, but just in case it is, we do have a slide from Dr. Ibram X. Kendi, the author of a very famous book, particularly 2020 to date, around how to be an anti-racist. So what is an anti-racist? It's an individual who's expressing, it's one who's expressing the idea that racial groups are equals and none needs developing, and is supporting policy through their actions that reduce racial inequity. A racist is, in contrast to that, is someone who supports a racist policy through their actions or inaction or expressing a racist idea. And when we look at anti-racism, it's an active process of really identifying and challenging racism, but at the systemic level, at the institutional level, looking at organizational structures, policies, practices, and attitudes to really redistribute power in a more equitable manner. I would just add to that being anti-racist is also very much a personal journey. And I'm going to use an I statement here. There's a lot that I know about in the anti-racism space. There's also so much that I have to learn. There's so much history. There's so many different identities that have been historically minoritized and excluded, that I have to be on a continuous learning cycle and journey so that I can know how to show up for individuals and groups of people of the identities that I do not share or have a connection with. So you might be asking, like, well, why can't I just not be racist? And simply put, it's just not enough to be quietly non-racist. It's really the time to be vocally anti-racist. You'll see a quote up there. I won't read it. Let it just sit there for a moment. Also features the book by Dr. Kendi. And we want to focus on, not being as passive and finding one's own voice to really speak up when you see inequities, not just from like a racial inequity standpoint. I think that's now's a good time to just frame the rest of our conversation moving forward. Yes, we spend a lot of time talking about racial and ethnic equity, but there are many other groups that experience inequities and disparities. We also spend a lot of time looking at overrepresentation in comparison to the general population. We have to spend as much time, care, and attention looking at who's underrepresented. And we know from previous trainings that we've spent a lot of time unpacking some of the pan-ethnic umbrellas that are kind of homogenizing to specific cultures and groups. If you look at the American Indian, Alaska Native group, and Alyssa, feel free to weigh in here on the Alaska Native piece. I know you've done a lot of work up in Alaska Balance of State and Anchorage, but there are so many different tribes in that area that the Alaska Native pan-ethnic umbrella doesn't capture or speak to the rich diversity and culture there. We lead with race very explicitly, but that is not exclusively. The concepts that we share with you are to be applied to other historically minoritized and oppressed groups in your work. So, folks with disabilities, that's a huge minoritized group that faces a lot of disparities. The LGBTQ population, if you're looking at age, we know we've got an aging population experiencing homelessness throughout the country. Take what you're learning here and apply it across all of those different identities, because we want to right-size these inequities, not just for people based on race and ethnicity, but also within those other minoritized identities. So confronting racism, hashtag uncomfortable, right? Particularly for me as a Black woman, particularly for me as a Black woman who is someone that identifies within the LGBT community, particularly as I am learning and growing on my journey as a parent to a child with not one, but two intellectual and developmental disabilities. I'm going to couch that part of my identity for a little bit later. But really confronting racism is necessary. And I'm going to go a step further. I know what the slide says there. Confronting all of the isms, confronting all of the phobias is really important, right, for our work. And this type of work depends on the practice of conflict skills and the healing of traumas and insecurities that stand in that way. And what we're about to get into in just a moment around compassion and accountability really has to do with conflict skills. I don't know about any of you, I can only speak for myself, but it took me a very long time to, one, and understand that conflict can be healthy, and two, understand the skills that are needed to engage in a healthy conflict. Sitting with discomfort, shying away from being defensive when I'm called in or called out, being direct, not beating around the bush, having a level of confidence, but also leaning in with curiosity to listen actively, to listen without judgment, practicing patience and speaking with openness, right? That counteractive to defensiveness. But most importantly is learning and growing in my understanding of the need to practice deep self-reflection. How can I do something differently? How can I look at something differently? How can I learn more? about something that I may not have all of the information that I need to engage in this conflict or dialogue in a healthy way. So that said, we're going to talk a little bit about compassionate accountability. I will just note that, well, I'll get there in a second. What I want to talk about right now is emotional intelligence. When we think about emotional intelligence, you'll see sort of the different domains of self-awareness, motivation, empathy, social skills, and self-regulation, kind of circling the brain's emotional intelligence. Moods and emotions are constantly at play at work. Yet, up until recently, at least in my space in the homelessness field, and I've been in different spaces, folks have been hesitant to talk about moods with anyone else other than close friends or family. And according to a theorist named Howard Gardner, your emotional intelligence is the level of your ability to understand other people, what motivates them, and how to work cooperatively with them. So when you break down those 5 domains that are kind of circling emotional intelligence, it's really about recognizing your own emotions and the impact or the effect that it has on other people, as well as yourself, stepping into sureness about your capabilities, really managing disruptive impulses, maintaining standards of honesty and integrity, taking responsibility for your own actions, performance, being open to new ideas. Like the list really goes on and on and on. But this emotional intelligence really is a driving factor around how to understand, negotiate, and resolve disagreements, while like nurturing relationships and creating a better group synergy. You might be asking, like, what does emotional intelligence have to do with calling in and calling out? Well, here we have the what we call the compassionate accountability ladder. Just wanted to note, compassion and accountability is a registered trademark of Next Element Consulting. And there's actually a suggested reading to explore this concept further. And it's called Conflict Without Casualties, a field guide for leading with compassion and accountability. And it's authored by Dr. Nate Regier. I hope I didn't butcher Nate's name there. But all in a nutshell, compassionate accountability is about a commitment to kind self-truth telling, and shifting from a powerless victim to a powerful accountable person. So you see there are 4 areas within, do I have a little, I don't think I have a little laser on this platform, but there are 4 areas. At the bottom of the ladder, you have victim that is powerless, and at the top you have someone that's responsible and powerful. So climbing up the ladder of compassion and accountability, and this really applies for oneself, is going from either being unaware, blaming others, making excuses, to waiting and hoping, to kind of crossing into like, let's live in a moment of truth, let's acknowledge reality. This is where you own it, this is where you find solutions, and this is where you fix it. And through this ladder, you have an opportunity to either kind of sit in the victim powerless range or shift to the responsible and powerful. And these are actions that one would need to take themselves. We're sharing the compassionate accountability ladder because, and I'm going to use I statements again here, there have been times where I have caused harm, whether intentionally or unintentionally, doesn't matter. If I have caused harm with or to someone, it is my responsibility to be accountable, to give myself grace, but also to be accountable. And you can't do that if you're caught in a cycle of, lacking awareness, blaming others, making excuses, or like kind of waiting and hoping as you're in that like pre-contemplation stage of, I might have done something wrong. Moving into the ownership, right? And the top tier of the ladder is where you're acknowledging that harm has been caused, you are owning it and coming to terms, but you're finding solutions and moving towards making amends. in a workplace setting. And again, the book that I mentioned around compassionate accountability really is a powerful read. Dr. Reger says in his book that conflict does not have to cause casualties, because if we reframe conflict as simply a gap between what we want and what we're experiencing, then we'll look at it as a source of energy. It's neither good nor bad. It's more about how we use that energy. So we can struggle against ourselves and others in drama to feel justified and misuse all that energy, or we can struggle with others in compassion to create something amazing. So in the book and on their website, they talk about the different roles. So we talked a little bit on the compassion and accountability ladder for self about the victim role. But there's also two other roles. There's the role of a persecutor and the role of a rescuer. And it talks a little bit about the cycle and how these roles interface with each other. Accountability without compassion is detached, distant, and disheartening. So that persecutor role. Holding others accountable demonstrates respect for people. And this isn't an either or concept. It's really choosing both. We want to shift away from the cycle of drama where you have like the victim, the rescuer, the persecutor, and you want to move towards the compassion cycle. Going to pause there so that we can, first I can check the chat. I can't see because I am, okay. All right, I'm caught up on the chat. Now we want to move to calling in and calling out. So as Alyssa and I were preparing for this, shout out to Alyssa for like bringing all of the content together. But when you look at calling in and calling out, there's really a fine line between the two. And I'm actually going to start with calling out first, because that's really bringing public attention to an individual group or organization's harmful words or behavior. There's a link in the slide there. Calling out can have a backfiring effect. Sometimes it can be really helpful, and sometimes it's really appropriate for a situation. Quick example here, if I am facilitating a training or holding a meeting and someone uses racial slur, ethnic epithet, something extremely offensive that is generally accepted as extremely offensive, we're going to call it out. I think another example of a call out that I saw done very eloquently was something that was not generally known as being historically harmful. Alyssa and I and two other colleagues were actually at a meeting in Oregon. It was an all-day task force retreat, and member of our facilitation team, there was like a reference used that I won't repeat here, but it was something very offensive to people of Vietnamese ancestry. And she was able to do a quick call out that was so harmful and non-offensive and non-threatening. But what it did was it created a learning opportunity for folks that wouldn't have had that historical knowledge, and self included, pointing at self here. Calling in is a little bit different because it's an invitation to more of a one-on-one or small group conversation to really focus on an individual or group's harmful words or behavior, which can, run the gamut of bias, prejudice, microaggressions, and discrimination. Alyssa, did you have any context that you wanted to add around calling in and calling out?
I don't think so right now. I did grab the links in the slide and drop it in. I think, the definitions on here are helpful as we think about the distinction, because like you said, Mary, it's a fine line. Both have their purpose in how we address racism, and sometimes one is going to be more effective than the other. And I think it is, nobody gets this right all the time, and figuring out, as we move forward, what's going to work best in any given situation. And it's going to depend on the relationship you have with that person, what the calling in or calling out is about. I remember that, in Oregon, in the way that was handled, and that was great. Earlier this week, we were talking about the term stakeholder, because that is a fairly new learning experience for me of why that term has harmful impact on Indigenous and tribal nations folks. And so we were in a session where we were talking about shifting away from the term, and it was because someone in the room had used the word, right? So we took it as a time to pause and just say, this is what we have learned over the last several months, and it's difficult because that term is so commonly incorporated into our language, especially as we think about like, well, it's an entity, but they're not quite yet a partner, so we don't want to call them all partners because we're attempting to make them partners. And so what are the different terms that we can use instead, but acknowledging that like, when I still slip up and use that term when I don't mean to, like just being able to own that. So.
Thanks. And I think that's a really good segue into tone policing, which I also have a story to share about that. But tone policing is really a conversational tactic that dismisses the ideas that are being communicated when the other person's perception is that they are being delivered in an angry or frustrated or sad, fearful, or otherwise emotionally charged manner. Tone policing can be very suppressive. It can be racist. It is often condescending. It takes away from the issue at hand because it's focusing on the delivery instead of the message. And it has been historically used to silence minoritized populations, racially and otherwise. When we talk about sort of efficacy of like calling in versus calling out, going back to compassion and accountability, calling in really uses an approach that's non-threatening. And it seeks to minimize the feelings of embarrassment or shame. One of the questions that kind of surfaces when we're talking about like, do we call in or do we call out? Is like, does this prioritize comfort of the violator over racial equity progress? Alyssa and I actually came across an article as we were preparing for this today's session that really broke down and gave us some other things to think about around the calling out versus calling in debate. Being a dangerous distraction from actual anti-racism work. And I think Alyssa's dropped that in the chat for you all to follow along. I tend to be someone that really prefers to take a position of compassion and accountability. I have had to learn that over time. I think that I am also very conscious of my identities. Some of those identities that I mentioned when I was introducing myself. And there have been many professional experiences where I am the minority, the only minority, or one of many minorities with power dynamics in which other people that are not minorities hold positions of power. Therefore, I have found this as almost as a way to cope with those power imbalances and recognizing how I can be effective as a woman, as a Black woman who is a parent of a child with a disability. Because there are things, just like we talked about tone policing, that can often tune someone out of a very important, serious, and real message that I'm trying to convey. So while I love compassion and ability, it is not lost upon me that because of the identities that I hold, I don't necessarily have the same privilege to call out and not be perceived as angry and not be perceived as disruptive and not be perceived as aggressive, and some of those other undertones that often come with tone policing. And that is unfortunately a coping skill that I've had to learn over my professional career of, 16 years now, definitely an art and not a science. That being said, it's great that I have had to grow into compassion and accountability and the ability to call people in, because that has led me to find more comfort in being able to call out. Like today I feel empowered to call things out that maybe 5 years ago, 10 years ago, you might not have had a peep out of me, and I would have been sort of succumbed to the bystander's effect. or bystander syndrome. I can't remember the name of it, but where you see something that's happening, you know it's bad, you know it's wrong, and you kind of just freeze. I wouldn't freeze today, but that has had to come over time. That has had to come with practice, and I'll share an example in just a second. Calling out does maintain a focus on accountability. The question in the article that's raised is like, can racism end without tension and necessary discomfort? In my mind, probably not. Like, someone's going to be uncomfortable, either the person who's calling out, which I have had to do, or found myself in the position of needing to call folks out regardless of their power dynamics. And I can tell you it's been really uncomfortable going through the process of calling out and thinking about the potential ramifications of doing so, and doing so publicly. Moving on so that we can get to sort of the experiences and the really concrete examples of calling in and calling out. You'll see there a picture of Colin Kaepernick. Y'all are in California, so I would suspect you know who Colin Kaepernick is. But he is emerged as, in my view, one of the civil rights activists of our time. And, you know, calling in doesn't always work. Something so simple as kneeling in protest during the national anthem, upon, you know, being advised by someone with a military background who has served as a veteran in our country, in shaping the ways in which this protest was designed, received a lot of backlash and has been kind of put off to the side of playing football, has impacted their source of income pretty permanently. And addressing racial inequity is often about power and resource alignment. And, you know, calling in is a way, it can be another way of saying, whatever you do, please don't make white people mad. That goes back to the slide that we just had up around, you know, does calling in appease to comfort someone's comfortability level too much? Are we kind of acquiescing instead of being direct? Are we making it too comfortable so that feelings aren't hurt? And I don't know if I've developed a sound position one way or the other. I think it goes back to being able to do both and being comfortable with doing both based on your own identities, your own level of comfortability. I think the key takeaway here is whether you call someone in or call someone out, when you see something being done that's harmful to others or a group of others, do one, don't do nothing. Pick which one you want to do, but don't do nothing. Real anti-racism progress requires both a push and pull strategy. So I want to pause there, because I think Alyssa and I have some concrete examples to share. Each of you, this is a very small group. We've got plenty of time. If you're comfortable, you can feel free to share and engage and talk, come off mute, however you'd prefer. But Alyssa, I know you've got to hop on a plane in just a little bit, so I'm going to kick it over to you right now and be quiet for a little bit.
I do. Thanks for that. And I really hope folks can hear me and there's not too much distracting background noise. It's very distracting to me, but I will try and minimize that for you all. So I just want to first say thank you for giving us this space to kind of talk about these things today. And this is only the second time that I really talked about this experience in a setting that is more than like a one-on-one conversation. And so the first time I did it was actually yesterday at NHSBC, and my voice shook the whole time. It was just a very different level of sharing. And so I'm hoping that since practice makes perfect, I'll be a little bit better today. But if I wander a little bit in this discussion, that is why. And I think you will understand why in a moment. So I think over the last couple of years, I have found myself in a lot of different spaces and places where we really are doing and moving forward equity work. So whether that's working directly with communities, working with different colleagues, working with different firms, working with HUD, working with other customers, and clients, we've really worked on not saying that equity is this additional thing that we're doing, but really bringing it into this is the way we do the work. And so I found myself in these spaces with a lot of amazing folks over the last couple of years. And especially during the pandemic, as folks were trying to stay connected and, not feel isolated as we were engaging in this really hard work, we leveraged a lot of like virtual platforms, Teams. I don't know if you all have Teams, but Teams and mural boards and jam boards and all those different spaces and places where we could stay connected. And so this experience happened in one of those virtual situations, and somebody was just trying to connect with other folks in this specific team. And the question was simply like, hey, what do you eat when you're not feeling good? Like, what's your comfort food, right? Because that was something that was not related to work and trying to stay connected to folks. And so people were writing things into the chat. And one of the things that somebody wrote was, oh, my family made up this recipe and it is this, this, and this, and we call it gook. And I had not seen the chat for a very long time, but that had happened in a morning. And by early afternoon, there were a couple other comments that came in from other folks after that had been put into the chat, but they were very much like, oh, that sounds really good. And actually, somebody else actually repeated the term in the comment that they said in response to the initial chat, and then proceeded to say what their comfort food was and all of those pieces. So I was a little bit like, did that really just happen several hours later when I was catching up to the chat? And two, did nobody really know what that word is and means? So I wasn't quite sure how I was going to respond. And when I did, all I said was, your family might want to look at changing the name of that comfort food. And then I even put a little heart emoji, right? Because I'm not in the space where I felt like I wanted to say much more than that at that point in time. And so we moved on, people moved on. And at one point, there's reactions in some chats that we have. And somebody actually put a laughing reaction. And I think they really thought Alyssa just thought that term was funny. She's just being funny. And then people, I think what they started doing was Googling and realizing Alyssa's not just being funny. This is an issue. This is a term that is derogatory towards Asians. And it's still surprising to me now, looking back at it, that I was the one that knew that, and it seemed as if nobody else did. And so I also know that people are very, very busy, so it could have been people just completely missed the chat and not a thing that we saw. So after that scenario happened, there were a couple of ways in which the aftermath occurred. So I think there were, from the person that actually initially wrote the term in the chat, there was reaching out to me via Teams, text, email, calling. It was very much they wanted me to know that they just didn't know that term was derogatory, what it meant, that they had already connected with their family and they were going to change the name and all of those pieces. And it very much felt like I needed to make sure that they needed to make sure that I knew that it was not done out of intentional harm, and that it was literally because they didn't know the term, and that they weren't a bad person, and that they hadn't meant it, and all of those different pieces. I don't believe that this person is a bad person. I never believed that this person was a bad person, but in those moments, it very much felt like I needed to put aside any harm that was caused and make sure that they felt better, and that I knew that they were not a bad person, and they were truly a good person and in this equity work. So the experience has definitely felt like it centered the person who caused the harm in different ways and in different responses. And it has changed the way that I interact with folks even still today. And so I think in that scenario, there was a little bit of like, I felt like the comment that I put in the chat was very much a little bit of like calling in, or at least asking folks to like think about what was written in there and just like what that term means. And if you need to Google, then you Google. I personally didn't have to Google that term because it has been used against me in my life, so I knew what it meant. There was a little bit of like calling out in that as well. And that also, calling in doesn't always work. And sometimes even calling out doesn't always work. But again, what Mary said earlier really resonates of like, don't do nothing, right? Like, even if it doesn't work in that moment, I think the fact that there was somebody that called out the scenario, like I still remember that person and I still remember what they said. And I'm very like grateful to that person, even if at the end of the day, it didn't feel like it changed much. And I think we'll just end with, like I said earlier, when I was talking about the term stakeholder, I am still learning in this space every single day. And I know I have caused harm and I will continue to cause harm. And my hope is that people call me in and call me out when those situations happen. And that when they do, that I'm not the one, that I don't center myself in that response, because it's in those moments when I cause harm, it's not their responsibility to make sure that I feel like I'm a good person. It is my responsibility to make sure that, one, I apologize for the harm that I've caused, but then not continue to put it on them to make me feel better. So that is my personal experience that I'm sharing today with you all, and kind of some examples of how there was both calling in and calling out that happened in that scenario, and kind of the, not fallout, but just there's still work to be done. There's still work to be done, and there will always be work to be done.
Thanks for sharing that, Alyssa. I want to just color the story in a little bit more as well. There were other things that happened post that kind of stuck with me a little differently than it may have stuck with you or others as that occurred. And I think the two things at play that we didn't discuss too much were there were extreme power dynamics at play that makes calling in and calling out much more difficult. So even if someone did know that, they might not have been in a position where they felt they could. And that's something that needed to be addressed. And I think as a team, we did that. The second part is, when you make a mistake, own it completely. In this particular situation, in trying to fix it, the term was edited out of the chat. And that to me felt like disingenuous, and that when that was taken out, it was trying to just bury it or make it like it didn't happen. And I think one of the worst things you can do is, it's not the crime, it's the cover up that really gets people. And I think that is something that from a racial equity, learning standpoint, if you make a mistake, own it, live with it. It's there. It should always be there to remind you of those mistakes. And I know I've made my share, and I'm sure you have as well. But those two things also continued to build on the issue that was risen. So I just wanted to share those two pieces.
Thank you, Alyssa, and thank you, Chris. I was not expecting that, although I feel like maybe I should have been expecting that. And for me, that definitely kicks up some feelings and some emotions. I remember that happening very vividly. And, there were, to add additional context, I think there were some folks on the team that were like immediately like, let's make sure Alyssa's good. Let's check on Alyssa. But that wasn't consistent across the team. And that is something, we're very much a work in progress, very much growing and learning. And it didn't make it feel better. I would say that the other piece that really relates to what happened to you, Alyssa, is the othering, right? Because I am someone who didn't know what that term meant, and had to play catch up in the chat and see another colleague defining it to figure out what was happening. And that's a direct result of the fact that folks who identify as Asian are often othered, right? That's a constant, like cycle that we encounter. Even though we just talked about othering last week, that's a very classic example of, the majority of folks know other terms that are harmful towards other specific races. How come we didn't know about this term? And while in one breath, it is true that there are so many damaging and harmful and derogatory terms out there, there just isn't as much visibility about other aspects of our history, other aspects of harm, which is why I think as a team, we have really tried to kind of balance the Black-white narrative, or binary narrative that is often found in racial equity spaces, and really try to bring a plethora of identities into this space. I statement here again, I have so much to learn. And I learned that day in, one of my colleagues' more painful experiences, which was not like, that's not how I want to ever learn. And I'm grateful for the folks that did do direct call outs that happened in many different ways. I think that the experiences I have to share around calling in are really centered around one of my colleagues who, uses they, them pronouns and often gets misgendered, often. And man, have I had to perfect my call in, and just, when it happens in a meeting setting, just say, hey, this person uses they, them pronouns. Please make note of that for the future. And it's become routine, A, because it happens so much still in different audiences, but B, it's also because of, people are just, you have to build muscle memory. You got to build muscle memory of doing something in practice for it to become second nature. And that's an example that has really become second nature for me. Another piece is around names. Oftentimes, we in our country, we learn a very Americanized English standard, and folks with different backgrounds, different identities that have names that we don't necessarily how to pronounce phonetically or otherwise. We had a colleague that shared this cool function called Hear My Name. Our whole entire division uses this on our signature line to be in solidarity with our colleagues whose names are often mispronounced, or who, colleagues that have to constantly say, no, it's actually pronounced this way. So a measure that we've taken to call people in is really, I would say, on the prevention side of really just having everyone use this feature, so that anyone who's uncertain about a name can click on hear it in order to understand the correct pronunciation without having to, we're human, we forget if we don't interact with someone on a regular basis, but without having to impose an undue burden on them to continue to have to say their name more than once because it's not pronounced like Mary is. A call out is from a prior work experience that was very uncomfortable for me, but it was at a time where I was pumped up with energy. It was during the season of 2020 when there were a lot of things happening in our country that resulted in a lot of protests, a lot of visibility, and just this surgence of a need to do something and do something different in the social justice and racial justice space. And unfortunately, one of my former colleagues was the recipient of a very public microaggression by way of an email exchange that was forwarded that referenced them in a disparaging way. This is an email that went out by someone who held a lot of power at a very high level in executive leadership. And it went out to about 700 people, 700 employees for the agency that we were all working for. And it was so harmful. This was one of the only Black women on our executive or senior leadership team. And she was also a dark-skinned Black woman. And, the email went out, it was circulating, people were buzzing, and I made a decision not to reply all to that email, but to forward the email and highlight the microaggression for the entire leadership team of which I was a member. very uncomfortable, very uncomfortable, very uncertain, wasn't sure what the ramifications would be or if I would be blackballed from the agency, but I did it. I decided to be a little bit courageous for whatever reason. I think I was reeling from all of the national events that were happening in our country at the time. And yeah, I did it, and it was a call in. It was a teachable moment. I used some of our training from, oh goodness, I think it was Service Never Sleeps allyship training, Oops, Ouch, Educate. And I did it, and it created a teachable moment. And guess what? We all got together and we talked about it, and we talked about the harm, and people agreed, and we trudged forward. And that leader had to learn how to, she just had to learn that it's not okay to even do something like that when you think it's behind closed doors. You sent an email to an entire agency without realizing that you were forwarding a part of a private communication for everyone to see. And there was very public apology made, but also, and more importantly, it led to some change behavior, change practices, and additional time to really unpack what had happened and how the incident that occurred, the microaggression via email, really highlighted the day-to-day experience of minoritized communities. And that was what prompted the change. Like, this isn't a one-off. This is what happens behind closed doors, and we got to start doing something differently, and, make amends for mistakes that are made this publicly. I think those are my examples. Do any of you all have anything that you want to share? And thank you, Alyssa. I know you're hopping off or have already hopped off. We appreciate it. We'll just kind of leave this time open for folks to share or ask questions about calling in or calling out. And I can, Chris, I'm going to pull these slides down now, if that's okay with you, so we can see folks. Can't see. There we go. That's okay, Kristen, and thank you for being brave enough to share that. I have had tons of lost opportunities to call in and call out. So even though I was courageous that one time, I was not courageous many other times. It's something that you grow into. It's something that you progress towards, as you grow in your journey.
Yeah, I was so shocked and taken aback by what happened that I was left kind of speechless, right? And so I tend to be a very slow, methodical thinker. So I wish I had thought quicker to say something. That it was a tribal meeting, and the tribe's consultant wished everybody a happy Thanksgiving. And I was just like, wow, oh, what do I do with this, right? I was just so, I'm not a racist person, never have been, but how do I even approach this? How do I be anti-racist in this situation? What do I do, right? And it was at the end of the call, and so I didn't even know how to deal with it.
And that's exactly what I was talking about, the bystander effect earlier. Like, every single person, self included, has gone through a period where it's like you freeze. And you think about like, okay, what are all the paths forward here? What do I do? How do I respond to this? How do I press forward? And we're not always going to get it right. But what we do have is an opportunity to think about the future moving forward and how we can maybe not get it exactly the way that we want it, but we can do something and not do nothing. And that
You're
just,
right. You're right.
I-
That missed opportunity, I think it sticks with me because I missed it and I want to make sure to get it next time, right? I don't want to lose that lesson. I don't want it to fall low in my memory banks, which tends to happen nowadays. But yeah, thank you.
thanks for sharing.
Yeah, something Rachel put in the chat that is kind of speaking. Sorry, Mary Frances. All right, we're gonna try talking again. Maybe this time it'll work. Something in the chat that Rachel put that's kind of calling to me is, understanding that different generations have different knowledge or understanding or access to this information, and I think that at least in my family relationships, I tend to look more critically at my parents, my grandparents, my great-grandparents, and what they did in the context of their lifespans versus the context of my lifespan. And I think that's a really hard thing to do, because you don't want to say, yes, of course, my grandparents were overtly racist people, but they definitely did things that in their space and time didn't seem racist, but did to me. And I think that's a really hard thing to navigate within your own family relationship, and something that is, at least for me, a tension I have often with my particular family, and how I call them out or call that or don't. Do I let it go? Do I not let it go? How do I do that? It's a really personal journey to make those decisions of when to and when to not do. But to kind of go back to Kirsten's comment, if it really haunts you and sticks with you, probably you didn't make the right decision in that moment. At least that's how it felt in my circumstances, and tried to adjust accordingly. But sometimes I adjust too far and I call out too hard, and it doesn't have a consequence. So there is a lot of, really understanding the moment, really understanding the people you're talking to be most effective. I think I'll stop there.
And I just want to highlight Willow's comment in the chat, making me tear up a little bit. And thank you for naming that about freezing up around misgendering piece, but also the ableism piece. 6 years ago, I wouldn't have been able to talk to you about ableism. It didn't impact me. And I'm not shaking my head that way to be nonchalant. I have had to learn about ableism through my son's eyes, and what it looks like for him to navigate a world that relies on verbal communication as opposed to nonverbal communication, relying, on his lens to navigate spatial proximity, right? He doesn't have very good boundaries, and he has challenges with depth perception. So he might stand right here to you. It's not because he's trying to threaten your space. It's because he wants to be able to see, or that he has to touch and feel everything because that's the way that his little sensories work. And, you said, Willow, in the chat, it's so important for us to be uncomfortable together to show solidarity. And that is exactly one of the takeaways from this presentation that I want each of you to have, which is it's going to be uncomfortable. I don't always know how to show up for folks with disabilities, but I try my darndest. And I try to understand the perspective, the disability perspective, from what I've learned through having, one neurotypical kid and one very neurodivergent kid who is an amazing rock star. Chris can attest to that. But it just, we've got to get out of our comfort zone in order to help support others whose identities that we may or may not know about on surface level. If you look at Milo, you don't necessarily know that he has 2 intellectual and developmental disabilities. He just looks like a cute little kid who, invades others' space at times. Anyone else? Oh, I love that follow-up. Yep. Disability justice is a wonderful intersection of anti-racism and disability. Absolutely.
I'm building off of what Chris said. There was a success, right? I'm not always a failure. I did call out my father when I visited, and he is of a different generation, right? He's in his 80s. And I managed to do it in a way that didn't go to excess, where I closed the conversation down. I was able to stay calm. And that felt really good to have that conversation that I hope expanded his knowledge a little bit, even at his age. So it is a learning experience. I had my ass handed to me one time by somebody because I wasn't being sensitive, and there was no bad intent. I didn't use any racial slurs or anything, right? But there is this change, right? I am of a generation that is older than the current generation that is bringing all these inequities up to the surface, and it's wonderful. I'm embracing it, but I have to learn it, right? And sometimes it's not comfortable learning it. And I felt so bad because my intent wasn't there, and I'm very empathetic of others. I started crying, and of course then I was like, oh great, now there's the white fragility on display, right? So it was like, there's just, I don't know, there's so much to unpack here, and I'm so thankful for this workshop today.
Yeah, another good point there from Willow. Intent versus impact is very important to keep in mind. Anyone else? We've got time, but we also can end a little early as well. This is a smaller group.
Well, I really appreciated hearing others' experiences, yours and Alicia's. So thank you for that. I'm sure it's not easy to relive those things. I know that I have things in my past that weren't comfortable, and so it's not always easy to relive that. So thank you for sharing so that we can learn.
Just a gentle call in. It's Alyssa, not Alicia.
Though to be fair, when I introduce her, I often mess it up because I'm cognizant I'm going to mess it up, so I mess it up. I walk myself right into that. But thank you for that again, Kirsten. Anything else folks want to share or discuss? This is your space as much as it is anyone's. I want to hear anything you have in this space. It is not always easy, but it is the work that we have to do now. All right, Mary Frances, anything you would like to say before we conclude, or shall we just wrap up?
No, I think we can go ahead and wrap up. I just wanted to say that I actually love these smaller spaces because it does give us a chance to have a greater sense of intimacy. And for anyone that wants to come along and poke their nose in what we've talked about here, these are posted on the training recordings page. So thank you to each of you for just showing up today. I know we have different types of processors in the audience. So for those of you that are kind of absorbing the content and sitting with it, just appreciate you being here in that space, because that's also very powerful, just as powerful as actually sharing your own experiences. So thank you so much, and I hope each of you have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you, Mary. Frances,
thank you.
Alyssa. This will actually be our last racial equity session of this year. We will start back up again next year, don't worry. But it is getting to that time of year where scheduling trainings is a little more difficult. So we're going to take a couple-month break. We do have other trainings that are occurring, so we're just taking a break on the racial equity and a few other of our things. But I want to thank Mary Frances and Alyssa for presenting, Aaron for keeping things rolling, all of you for attending this California Housing and Community Development Community Workshop offered through the Emergency Solutions Grant, Coronavirus Relief Consulting and Staffing Services Contract. Look out for more information next year on our racial equity series. When you exit, there's a 3-question survey. Please fill that out. We do read those every single week, and oftentimes they turn into new sessions or good ideas for how to do sessions better. So please feel free to do that. We really, really appreciate it. Until then, we will see you next time. Be well.